All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for logging in to hear part one of our two-part lecture for History 121, Week 3. For this first lecture, I'm going to go over all of the remaining notes for the Unit 1 test, as well as some information on the test itself. I'm going to go ahead and get the PowerPoint started here and certainly hope that you are able to follow along with us. And if you have any questions about the lecture, please feel free to reach out to me via email. All right, so this week's topic for part one is the American Revolution, which we've spent a bit of time talking about the path to over the past 2 weeks. Our objectives for this evening are going to focus on objective number 4 and beyond. And hopefully by now you have some familiarity with the first 3 objectives on this screen. Just a reminder as well that for this week's test, you are going to have 3 choices for essay questions. A very strong reminder that you are to only answer one of these 3 questions on the actual test itself. So please make sure that you prepare for an essay and are ready to answer it on this week's test. So just to recap, we talked last week through your work in class about a timeline of events to the American Revolution. And of course, the real path to the American Revolution starts with the ending of the French and Indian War. This end twofold causes the American Revolution because not only did the British incur great costs in fighting the French and Indian War, but they also implemented the Proclamation Line of 1763, which had to be protected by British troops and incurred further costs. As you probably recall, in order to offset these costs, the British passed a series of pacts and acts that further made the British government less having to shoulder the impact of the French and Indian War. And of course, the colonists were not very happy. In one of their first acts of rebellion in 1765, they hold the Stamp Act Congress to formally request the repeal of the Stamp Act. They are successful in getting it repealed the following year. However, it is replaced by additional acts such as the Declaratory Acts, the Townshend Acts, that are also not very friendly to the colonists. The first major action between the British and the colonists that results in public unrest is 1770's Boston Massacre. And of course, as we know, 5 colonists perished during this event, and it sets off a lot of unrest and bad feelings throughout the English colonies. One event that you may not recognize on this list is that in 1772, colonists burning the Gaspee. This particular event occurred because the British had stationed ships off of the coast of the colonies in order to prevent smuggling. One such ship, the Gaspee, came upon a smuggling ship, and the colonists decided to board the Gaspee and set it on fire so that it was unable to prevent the smuggling. And of course, the British themselves are not very happy with this, but many colonists were also quite alarmed by this turn of events. And as a result, one of the things that happens is the setup of the committees of correspondence in order to better facilitate communication between the colonies and to go forward on a unified path. And then one of the things that also results from that is, of course, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which in turn results in the Intolerable Acts, and then the First Continental Congress, which decides to reconvene the following May. But before that happens, of course, we know that the troops meet on April 1775 in the battles of Lexington and Concord. So let's talk real quick about the situation between the British and the United States. Take a moment and study the chart that is on the screen and see what you identify as the strengths and weaknesses of the colonies in their fight against the British. So, as you can see, most of the advantages did go to the British. They had more people, better manufacturing, more money, better trained army, as well as being a naval world power. But of course, the colonists do have some advantages. And these advantages, as we know now, looking back towards history, will ultimately decide the war in favor of the colonists. One of the highlights for the colonies was that they had a dedicated set of officers, helmed, of course, by George Washington, but also containing many other prominent individuals who would go on to fight on behalf of the future United States. They also had foreign leaders like the Marquis de Lafayette from France, who took on the cause and came to the Americas in order to help the colonists. They also had the home front advantage. They were, of course, familiar with the land and had easier access to supplies, and therefore were able to leverage that against the British during the battles of the Revolutionary War. And lastly, their motivation to fight was much greater than that of the well trained British soldiers because they felt that they were defending their homeland. Now, within the United States itself, or I should say the future United States at this time, there were three groups of people. There were the Loyalists, who made up about a third of the people in the country. There were the Patriots, who made up another third. And then there were those who considered themselves neutrals, who considered themselves to be the other third. Uh, since the ending of the war, some of the category percentages have been adjusted a little bit. Perhaps there were less loyalists, more neutrals, and less patriots, but the main arguments remain the same. You can see here on the left what the loyalists believed and why they chose to remain loyal to the British. Many of the loyalists, of course, were in the southern colonies, as we previously discussed. Of the colonial characteristics, you already know that the southern colonies were most closely aligned to their homeland, continuing to practice the faith of the Church of England in many cases, and also benefiting greatly from the trade of agricultural products such as tobacco, rice, and indigo with the homeland. The Patriots, on the other hand, were spread throughout the three colonial regions, although most heavily concentrated in the New England region. And they had very staunch beliefs about why we should move forward with the revolution and ultimately separation from the English colonies. Now, as the war begins, it's important to note that in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress does meet in Philadelphia and will remain in session throughout the vast majority of the Revolutionary War until the Articles of Confederation were ratified. And we'll talk about those in our next lecture. The Second Continental Congress' initial purpose when they decided to meet in May of 1775, the previous fall, was to revisit the success or lack of success of the boycott against British goods. Of course, prior to their meeting, which began on May 10th, 1775, the war breaks out with the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19th. So, the very first order of business that the Second Continental Congress must undertake is to appoint a military leader for what will be known as the Continental Army. And they had two men who were put forth largely for their consideration. One was John Hancock, who you learned about during your Revolutionary Personalities activity. Mr. Hancock was a wealthy New Englander from Massachusetts, from Boston, He was a very esteemed smuggler and very patriotic and supportive of the cause. The other individual, of course, was George Washington. And Washington had military experience, as we know from the French and Indian War. He also came from a rather aristocratic family in Virginia, and felt that he would be able to be a good and effective leader. Hancock had more money, but Washington had more experience. And in the end, the Continental Congress goes with George Washington, not only because of his experience and temperament, but also because of the fact that he hailed from the Southern colonies, which the Continental Congress knew had to be brought on board in order for the revolution to be successful. So they hoped that by picking a hometown boy, you could say, that they would then feel more allegiance to the revolutionary cause. And of course, as we know from our study of history, the choice of George Washington was certainly a great one. Now, we're going to turn a moment to a brief video on the Battle of Bunker Hill. Battle of Bunker Hill takes place in June of 1775. If for any reason you have trouble with the audio on this, you can revisit this video in the course documents section. All right, so the Battle of Bunker Hill, while not a victory for the colonists, does provide a significant morale boost and also shows the British that they have a harder fight ahead of them. That fall, the battles will continue and move west. The colonists decide that one of the best ways to be successful would be to attack the British fort at Quebec. As you recall from the end of the French and Indian War and the treaty that was issued in 1763, the British now had control of Canada. And so Benedict Arnold, who at that point has not yet turned traitor, and General Richard Montgomery set off on an 8-week journey to overtake troops in Quebec. Unfortunately, they were ill prepared. It was rather cold, and the troops are also afflicted with smallpox. Common sense would have dictated that they pull back and not continue forward with their journey. However, they did not operate using the best sense at that time, and Montgomery ends up actually getting killed in battle, and Arnold and the troops retreat. and the attempt to overtake Quebec in the fall of 1775 is a failure. Following January, a pivotal document is published that will inspire the colonists to continue their fight despite their failures in Canada, and that is the publication of a pamphlet known as Common Sense. It was written by Thomas Paine, who was actually born in England and emigrated to America. And it essentially said that it was common sense for the colonists to actually separate, to become independent from the British. Because it was published in pamphlet form and it was a short read, it was something that spread very quickly throughout the colonies and inspired those, even those who were wavering after the failures in Canada, to continue with fighting for the cause, or set us on the path to the Declaration of Independence the following summer. The Declaration of Independence is available for you in the course documents section of the course. If we had been in class, I would have had you look through a specific section of the Declaration of Independence and actually change it into modern English, and thinking about how this particular document is still relevant today. Unfortunately, since we're not together, what I would like you to do is to pause the lecture here and take a moment to read through the Declaration of Independence and think about how the Declaration is still relevant today and what exactly it meant back then. All right, welcome back from your break. Hopefully, the reading, or for many of you, the rereading of the Declaration of Independence in conjunction with this class provided you with some different insights to your previous exploration of the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence essentially is a list of grievances against the King of England. And the colonists send it to him and essentially say, you know, we've tried to work this out, but we're breaking up with you. Some call it the world's greatest breakup letter. And so, relevancy today, of course, is that many of the ideals that are espoused in the Declaration of Independence, even though they weren't truly being realized in America at that time, like life, liberty, property, and equality, are still things that we aspire to today in America and hopefully are getting closer to reaching. Now, as the Declaration is being written, it's important to think about the fact that the war is still going on. The Declaration, as we know, is penned in June of 1776 after its initial suggestion by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson heads the committee that is chosen to write the Declaration and does the bulk of its writing himself based on his studies of individuals like John Locke and Thomas Paine. But many of us don't think about the fact that while the Declaration was being written and then ultimately signed by its 56 signers in July of 1776, that the war is still going on. And one of the things about the Declaration was that it was made to be read in public. So the broadsheets were distributed throughout the colonies to be read in public places to troops and to other civilian colonists throughout the region. And along with the troops, there were also many women who were supporting the war effort. We have two images here that show the impact of women on the war effort. The image on the left shows women who were camp followers. Many initially viewed camp followers solely as prostitutes, but the reality of history is the fact that these women were typically, or many times, wives of soldiers. And while I'm sure they might have performed some of the duties that were implied, was really the cooking, the sewing, the tending of wounds, etc., for the troops. So they were a very valuable support unit for the troops. And the success of the revolution, in part, deserves to be credited to these women who helped keep the troops on their feet. The image on the right, of course, is the iconic presentation of the American flag by Betsy Ross to George Washington. this image to show the fact that even those women who were not camp followers also provided valuable contributions to the revolution. Many of these women maintained households and kept farms going in the absence of their husbands. They also performed duties at home, like sewing uniforms or flags or other items that would also help to support the war effort. And so these two scenes collectively illustrate some of the impact that women who are often unrepresented in the history of the revolution actually contributed. Now, December 26, 1776 is the pivotal landing of George Washington on the other side of the Delaware River, of course, depicted in recent commercials that I'm sure some of you have seen. Washington's crossing of the Delaware, and this particular painting that depicts it is one of the most iconic scenes of the American Revolution. Although this painting has some historical inaccuracies, including the fact that it is far lighter in the painting than it was during the actual crossing, which began on the evening of Christmas 1776. Um, it also depicts a native on the ship with Washington, which is also highly unlikely, and other, boats and things following along, which were the case, along with the chunks of ice. But really, the fact of the matter is that Washington probably wasn't standing there, sword drawn, and more than likely was hunkered down and attempting to keep warm on what was a very, very frigid evening. The surprise landing at Trenton and the overtaking of the British troops there provided a huge boost for colonial morale. By that point, actually identifying themselves as the United States, since this is post Declaration of Independence. And additional successes in the region of New Jersey would continue to aid the Continental Army in its eventual success in the American Revolution. But the success wasn't constant, and struggles were endured throughout the spring and summer of 1776. Um, and I should say, excuse me, 1777. At this time, the British appoint a new leader, General Johnny Burgoyne, who decides to adopt a strategy of attacking and overtaking the state of New York. So to do so, he moves into the Hudson River Valley. Burgoyne's plan is to cut through New York and seize it, therefore cutting off New England, the heart of the Revolution, from the rest of the colonies. Fortunately for the colonists, in the fall of 1777, they are successful in the Battle of Saratoga and turn Burgoyne's troops back, which will ultimately not only prevent the bisecting of the states, but also will help to shore up the support of the French, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So the Battle of Saratoga today is identified as the turning point of the American Revolution. Now back to Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress is still meeting. Now that they have officially broken away from the British and have identified themselves as their own independent nation, they need a constitution that will govern them. And so they create the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, which we'll talk more about in the next lecture, really established a firm league of friendship between the states. And while the Articles will have many faults that we will discuss, they did have some components that helped the new nation get on its feet. And so soon, the Continental Congress will become known as the Congress of Confederation. As this is going on in the summer of 1777, the British recognize that the former colonists are being more successful than they had initially believed that they would be. And so they actually make an offer of home rule. They say to the former colonies, we'll allow you to rule yourselves, but you can stay, part of the colonies. And of course, by this point in time, the colonies essentially say, forget about it. We're our own nation. Unfortunately, before the war will end in the winter of 1778, the colonists will undergo their final major test, and that is surviving the winter at Valley Forge, which is one of the most difficult challenges of the war itself. Located outside of the city of Philadelphia, Washington holds up his troops that winter in Valley Forge to help them be stationed close to New Jersey and Philadelphia. At this point in time, the British have re solidified holdings in the area, and Washington knows that he needs to make a final push to get the British out of there once the winter ends. Unfortunately, the troops are very ill prepared for the winter. Their uniforms are not warm enough. They're also lacking in food. Many individuals desert the Revolutionary Army during this season. Unfortunately for Washington, it is a tremendous struggle, but his leadership, as well as his ability to ultimately convince citizens in the area to support the troops, leads to the survival of the Continental Army. And also, then they are buoyed that spring by news that Benjamin Franklin has officially negotiated a treaty of alliance to gain assistance from France in the favor of the United States. The French are still mad at the British over the French and Indian War, and promises by the United States to help the French regain some territory in North America make this a profitable agreement between the two nations. That takes us to now the fall of 1781 in the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. All right, so the victory at Yorktown will end the fighting of the Revolutionary War, but the war itself will not end until 1783, officially, when the Treaty of Paris is drawn up, essentially attempting to remove all British influence from North America and turning over territory not only to the French, but also back to the Spanish. And we will, of course, see how that evolves for us in coming weeks. At this point, I'm going to turn to the test prep section of this lecture. Just to reiterate, the test will be opened up as of right now. You should already be able to see it. Under the assignments of Unit 1, you will have 2.5 hours to take the test at home. It is a continuously running clock. So once you start the test, you must continue to take it in one sitting. If for any reason you have a computer issue, you need to notify me immediately. Do not wait so that it can be rectified. Please make sure that you're taking the test from a computer with a consistent internet connection. And you can always, of course, go to campus and utilize the computers there if you are worried about your home computer. The test has 15 true and false questions, 30 multiple choice, and 1 essay. For the essay, again, remember you will choose one of the 3 questions. If you have been keeping up with your textbook reading and the activities in class, you should be well prepared for the test. My recommendation is that you go through and answer any questions that you know or are fairly certain that you know. Write your essay and then go back and use your textbook and other resources to finalize your other answers. Do not look up each answer as you go through the test, otherwise, you will run out of time. The essay must be submitted with the test. I will not take it late or in another format. So you need to make sure that you allot your time properly. If you have additional questions about studying for the test or the content of the test, please feel free to reach out to me via email. Please use the password Louisville so I know that you have actually listened to this recording and are not just asking questions without having properly prepared. For the essay itself, make sure that you utilize a paragraph format, preferably 5 paragraphs with an intro and a conclusion, and make sure that you answer the question in full. Please read the essay questions in the test itself very carefully because they ask for specific content and information. All right, that's all for this part 1 lecture. Please tune back in for part 2 when you are ready. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week.